me start out. The Paciello Group is proud to present another accessibility webinar as part of Inclusive Design 24, which is our contribution to the Global Accessibility Awareness Day. I'm Brian Landrigan. I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing at TPG. I'm your moderator for today's session. We want a special thanks to Adobe for partnering with us on Inclusive Design 24. And we'd ask that if you want to post questions, use the tab at the bottom for Q&A or post in the chat so we can copy it in there. We'd also ask that you post questions, we'll hold them at the end, and as time allows, we'll have Marcy address the questions as we go on.
Okay.
Let me give your introduction, Marcy. Marcy Sutton.
Sounds good.
Marcy Sutton is a developer at Substantial, a 60-person product development company in Seattle, Washington. She's also an instructor and co-chair of the Seattle chapter of Girl Develop It, a nonprofit organization focused on teaching women the skills of software development. She can frequently be found riding a bicycle or playing frisbee with a dog who happens to have epic eyebrows. So without further ado, here's Marcy Sutton speaking to accessibility of web components.
All right, thanks for that great introduction, Brian. So I'm trying to gain control here from Carl. Yep, looks like that worked. Okay, woohoo, let's go. Greetings, Marklar. I am Marklar. Marklar at Marklar. Let's kick things off with a Marklar. A Marklar walks into a Marklar. Marklar asks the Marklar, do you have any Marklar? The Marklar shakes his Marklar and says, no, we only have Marklar. You're probably asking yourself at this point, what the Marklar is she talking about? Well, this has been an exercise in semantics. The meaning of our words, they're necessary. If we use the same word for everything, there wouldn't be any meaning. So the same is true with our HTML. The same word would be useless over and over. So today we're going to talk about a new technology, web components, which runs the risk of polluting the internet with a bunch of Marklar, soulless div tags essentially, that don't communicate role or purpose to non-visual users. As Brian said, I'm Marcy Sutton. I'm not a freelance Marklar, but rather a full-time developer at Substantial, which is a company here in Seattle. I've spent the past few months expanding my own skill set while improving the accessibility of web applications such as a fitness app for personal trainers and a whiskey recommendations app, because everybody likes whiskey, right? Why shouldn't those applications be accessible to everyone? I grew to love accessibility at my previous job because it added a valuable dimension to my work. It made it feel less like an everyday grind. Let's move forward. Oops, little lag here. Let's go back. So here we're looking at some HTML. And it's pretty bad. Every tag in this HTML is the same tag name, Marklar. We've got a background image of a Marklar GIF, some text about Apple's secret development program for the Intel x86 microprocessor, which was actually called Marklar, code name. We also have what looks like a link, but the tag name is still Marklar. And this is illustrating that if every tag name was the same, it would not be very useful. We'd probably cringe if we saw, like, substitute Marklar for a div, and you would cringe if you saw this. So it's definitely not something that we should be doing. Today we're going to talk about web components, which is a really awesome new technology. I should preface this by saying that I am not an expert. I don't work on specs all day. I'm just really curious and I'm passionate about accessibility. So the two parts of this that we're going to dive into, I'm going to be more specific about custom elements and the shadow DOM. So what are web components? They're new standards moving through the W3C. The 5 parts to this are custom elements, where you can actually create your own tags, which is awesome. Shadow DOM, templates, which is super useful for templating content on the client side. You previously would have to do something with like scripting, either PHP or using Grunt or some way to include partials of code. There's actually a client-side method for doing this now with templates. HTML imports is kind of similar. You can include a partial of code just like you would include a style sheet and a link tag, but you can include an HTML file, and it's a really exciting way to work for front-end development. And then lastly, one part of the spec that's still emerging are decorators. I don't know as much about them, but my limited research made them look pretty awesome. The idea is similar in your CSS, how you might include a background image. You could include a snippet of HTML in your CSS, and it would actually decorate your HTML. So it's presentation-related code, but rather than just being limited to CSS styling or applying a background image, you could actually apply markup through your CSS. So I'm really excited to see more about decorators. So why are we excited about web components? Why are there 2 talks about web components today? I'm pretty excited about them. As front-end developers, we love to talk about what's new. In this case, web components mean that we can extend the DOM. We can actually create our own elements, and we aren't waiting for browser implementers to create the next form input or some fancy button tag. We can go and create our own. And in the case of Shadow DOM, we can minimize conflicts. If you're implementing a jQuery plugin, I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you include somebody else's JavaScript and all of a sudden your JavaScript stops working because there was some conflict, maybe that plugin is polluting the global namespace, and that causes huge problems. Well, a nice thing about Shadow DOM is that you can encapsulate code to minimize conflicts, and the same goes for your CSS. If you had a rogue plugin that the CSS that came along with it, they defined styles for generic H1s and H2s, and then after you implemented that plugin, it started messing with your CSS. That's a huge bummer. It's override hell in CSS. So if you could minimize conflicts by encapsulating your web components, that's a pretty awesome way to work. So in the case of custom elements, if we were going to create our own tags, which I mentioned earlier, in this case, I think it would be pretty cool if you could make a taco button that when you interact with the taco button, it gives you tacos. So here we have a big tag that just says x-taco button. And the dash is because a requirement of naming your own elements is that you basically namespace them with a prefix and then a dash and then the name of your element. And this is going to prevent, in case they wanted to make a taco button later, I guess, we can create a collection of our own components that start with the prefix, and then, oh, and I see Dale saying Chrome is removing those prefixes soon. Yeah, we'll see. But that's how it is right now. So this element that I made, the taco button, if I tab through the page, this is my custom version of Reveal.js for my presentation slides. So I've actually added a few features to it. One of those was that every slide is visible if you just use it out of the box. So I made it so that only the current slide is visible. So let's go on to the button. Give me tacos. Got a little bit of a delay when I tab, so it's a little challenging too. There we go. Give me tacos. So I have this button. It received focus. It changed color. It has an outline. If I hit the Enter key, sit and wait for the latency here, but it should start giving us tacos any minute now. I sure hope so, because it worked this morning. Give me tacos. Give me tacos. There we go. All right, tacos. If we just keep hitting enter, we should get more and more tacos. I'm just going to let that go for a minute. Whoa. Okay, epilepsy warning, in case you're looking at the screen. I hit enter a few times with the lag. So the idea here, I'm going to refresh the page so that it's not so crazy. But with the taco button here, this is kind of a ridiculous example, right? Like, you don't need a button to really give you tacos, but one thing that you
And we lost Marcy.
And again, I think we may have lost Marcy's audio for a second there. We'll just get her right back. Apologize for that. Marcy, we got you back?
You got me back now?
Yes, we do.
Woo. I think sometimes this application just is like, I'm done, and it restarts. All right, so what I'm, yeah, too many tacos. I overloaded you with tacos. So what I was saying was, this element is pretty contrived. Like, it seems sort of ridiculous, but it has all of the same elements of one that you might want, which is an autocomplete widget. So there's a user control, the button, and you could swap that out for a text input or a search input. And as you would start typing in an autocomplete widget, it would make asynchronous requests to pull back results and show them to you. In this case, I'm showing you taco GIFs, but it's something where there's multiple parts and you always want it to do the same behavior, like make it a component that somebody could reuse and drop into a web page. That would be pretty awesome. So I am seeing in the chat that definitely not getting rid of the custom element prefixes from Alice, who works at Google. So yeah, keep an eye on that. I haven't really heard one way or the other, except that that's how it is right now. So I mentioned marklar earlier. If we don't really do anything, when we create these new elements, they don't have any meaning. They're basically just marklar tags. So we really need to add some semantics. So how do we add semantics to these custom elements? Well, we can extend a native element, and here we're looking at some JavaScript. We first need to create an object, and we're going to extend the HTML button element and its prototype. So we create a variable with an HTML button element prototype, and then we apply that to an element that we're going to create. So to actually get the semantics, we have to dynamically create an element and append it to the page. If you have an element that's already in your markup, it behaves a little differently. I think there's, at least in my testing, I've found that I have to actually generate the tag and insert it into the page to get most of this behavior. But when you're creating an element, you have to register the name. So here we are registering taco-button. And then we apply the prototype that we created in our object earlier. And then we append this thing to the page. So there's some really interesting things going on here that are really important. Rather than just extending HTML element, if you extend an existing element, then you can get some of its behavior. At least that's the goal. So custom elements right now, they don't have very wide support, but I really like working with native elements. That's what most of my research was done with, even though there are 2 polyfills right now, at least that I'm aware of. Native support for custom elements right now is in Chrome and Opera latest, and Firefox Nightly, I believe, or Firefox 30, which I assume is Nightly. And there's a great site, Are We Componentized Yet, that I've been checking for some of this stuff. And it's worth noting that everything I'm talking about moves so fast that it's really hard to keep up with it. I have found that presentations I gave on this a month ago are already outdated. So it changes really fast, and what's really cool is that browser implementers are hearing our call and making changes to these specs and the way they implement them. So if something, you know, for example, I'm hearing people talking about the custom element prefixes. Like, that's changing really fast. So we have to keep our eyes on it and remember that what I'm talking about right now will change really soon. So I mentioned there are two polyfills. There's one from Mozilla called Xtag, and it has a really nice library that it gives you where you can, rather than being up in your elbows or up to your elbows in native JavaScript, you can use a little bit of their object creation method. So here we're registering an Xtag element called X taco button, and I'm using the X dash to indicate that it's an Xtag element. But we do a similar thing, at least in my case. I extended an HTML, I should say button, it says div, HTML button element prototype. Their documentation says that if you put extends and then the type of the element that you want to extend, that's how you do it in Xtag. I found that it actually won't run if I include extends button. But one thing that's really nice about their library is that you get these lifecycle callback methods. So there's created, inserted, removed, attribute changed, and then events that look similar to, say, if you've used Backbone or Spine.js, you can wire up events really easily. So in the case of my taco button, I wired up a click event and a key down event so that I could make sure that my button would do what it's supposed to, which is show me taco gifs. So Xtag's pretty cool. There's another one called Polymer that I am excited to hear Alice's talk later today, because my research, I used Polymer's shim to expand support to more browsers, but I haven't done as much with creating elements in Polymer. So I just showed this as an example that their extends method is a little different. In the name registration up here at the top, it says extends button. So it's actually on the tag instead of in the JavaScript, but I imagine you can do it either way. I'm really interested to see what Alice has to add on this topic, but it's pretty similar to Xtag. They just structure their objects a little differently. So pretty awesome. So the idea of a polyfill to add is that in the case of the shim, you can guarantee that the custom elements and shadow DOM stuff that you're using is, you can add support to a larger number of browsers than just those 3 that I mentioned in the beginning. The native support is pretty spotty because these are such emerging specs. But with a little help with a JavaScript library, you can expand support, and I'll touch on which browsers they support a little later. So another way that you could add semantics is to use native child elements. So inside of a custom element, in this case, I'm making a taco surprise element, and it doesn't really have any semantics itself on the wrapping tag. It's basically just a div right now, and that gets read aloud as a group, at least in VoiceOver. So inside of my taco surprise element, if I use heading tags and buttons and paragraphs or image tags, instead of making a div for a button, I just use a button, then I can guarantee that I get all that behavior and it's interactive. Like, that's how you make something accessible. You just add semantics inside as the native child elements. And Dale is adding that I like 1H1 per page, apparently. I do, yeah. I don't think that the HTML5 heading algorithm is really being used. We've kind of determined that because screen readers aren't supporting it, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot there if you want to have a clear document structure. So I personally believe only 1H1 per page right now. So another way I wanted to add this in here to add semantics is you can always use attributes. Like, if you wanted to add a role. In my case, extending elements isn't really adding the role, I've found. I need to do some more research and play with it some more, but you can always just add an ARIA role to, if there is an existing native element that you want to extend or a existing behavior. In the case of button, I could add role equals button. And to get it to be interactive from the keyboard, I can add tab index property of 0. As I personally believe that you should not use numbers over 0 for tab index because it's too hard to manage your tab order. So on the screen right now, we have a taco button element. It has a role of button and tab index so that it'll be interactive. And to register callbacks on this, so to enable events, I am still creating an element, but it's already in the markup. So I've found that I can register the element so that it doesn't come up as an unknown element. But in order to register callbacks for events, I need to create an element and reference it in my JavaScript. But I can get it to read as a button by adding a button role. And Alice is asking if I added the role in the template or is the user adding those. A tab index, I think, would be a good candidate for adding in your JavaScript. So whenever you create the element, I think if you're creating a button element with JavaScript, it's certainly feasible that you could add tab index with JavaScript. And the same with the role. I think it's just whatever gets read aloud in assistive technology is what we should do. And if everything you're doing to instantiate a button is in JavaScript, then adding attributes with it seems fine to me. The less thing that the user would have to actually drop into their markup, or the end developer, if they could just add taco button and just the tag name, then that's less for them to forget. And we can just give them an element they can drop in. It comes with some JavaScript. The JavaScript adds all the necessary attributes. Then that seems like a better workflow because you've accounted for that. Mike Moore is asking, would adding the role in the JS result in a buffering issue in the assistive technology? That's a good question and what I was just wondering. In the case of tab index, you can add it with JavaScript, but I would like to do a little more testing about the role because that's a really good question. So wait a minute, we are talking about all of this really cool stuff. What happens in assistive technology? Like how do screen readers even read these elements? We've talked about semantics a little bit, but I think it's worth talking about how this stuff really works. So especially in the case of Shadow DOM, learning about all the stuff led me to read a lot more about trees as a data structure. And there are a couple characteristics of trees that are worth noting. They have a root value and subtrees of children. So we can see on the screen, I actually have a screenshot from a book on Scheme, the language. And it has a root node, and branching off of it are child node trees. There are no circles here. They don't meet each other. So they branch off of some root node. It's an interesting characteristic of this data structure that we interact with every day as front-end developers in the DOM. Browsers are also really complex applications. They're some of the most complex applications out there. So the rendering engine flow is super interesting when you start learning about web components because for me, in asking these questions about accessibility, I had to know how they're being attached to the page, what the screen reader experience would be, like where does that come in the life cycle of this? So this screenshot is from a really great article from HTML5 Rocks called How Browsers Work. And it shows you how HTML is parsed and tokenized. So they take every tag and create an object out of it. And that creates the DOM tree in this flow. And we're looking at the WebKit specific flow. The Firefox flow is a little different, or the Gecko. So when the DOM tree is created, style rules affect the tree. And so when these nodes are attached, if an element it has display none, that can affect what a screen reader gets. That's how we prevent hidden elements from being read aloud in a screen reader, is that if they aren't painted through this rendering process, then they're kept out of a screen reader experience. So this flow is super interesting to realize how JavaScript and styles affect the actual objects that are created and then handed off to assistive technology. And the intricacies of this, I could study forever. Like, I am just learning how this works. So I love talking about this stuff. If you're interested in learning more, I would really recommend reading the How Browsers Work article. I learn something new every time I read that. So getting into Shadow DOM. What is Shadow DOM? It means that something is encapsulated by hiding a DOM subtree under a shadow root. So there is a shadow root, is this new concept in Shadow DOM. I hadn't heard of it before. So the shadow root is actually the root node of a shadow tree. If we go back to the trees we were looking at, there was a root value, and then on each of the branches, those had a common parent. So if you added a DOM subtree and put it in this new boundary, the root node of that is the shadow root. And the actual encapsulation boundary that's created, we call the shadow boundary. And it's a separation between the regular DOM and the shadow DOM. And it's specified by a set of rules. And those rules seem to be changing quite often. That's what I was saying with the specs. They change really often. There was a property that you could add in your JavaScript when you created a shadow DOM that was called apply author styles, and it allowed you to cascade your CSS into the shadow DOM from the larger document. They deprecated that, and I have yet to hear what replaced it, but it was really useful if you, as the document owner, wanted your style sheet to cascade into the shadow DOM. Otherwise, when you create these shadow DOM subtrees, there are some CSS properties that cascade in and some that don't. Like the font will cascade in from the larger document. I think some colors come in, but not everything. Like, it's really strange. So which properties come in and which don't through that boundary seems like it might change, and this is the part of the specs that seem like we aren't on solid ground. So it'll be interesting to see where we land with that. One other term I'd like to add is the shadow host, which is the element hosting one or more shadow trees. So you can actually append more than one shadow DOM into a root node in your document. So we have a diagram here from the W3C shadow DOM spec, and we can see a document tree on the left side, and it has a shadow host, which, if you think of, a good example would be the video tag in HTML5. To create a video tag, you just drop in the video tag. You don't have to add the controls, the little speaker icon, or any of that range stuff. So you drop in the video tag, and if you have Shadow DOM enabled in your developer tools, you can actually see all of the controls that are behind the Shadow DOM boundary. So there's an interesting graphic here from the Shadow DOM spec that shows you the relationship between the shadow host and the shadow root, and then the shadow subtrees, which are the children of, for example, the video tags shadow DOM. So it's worth going and looking at a video tag in Chrome or some browser where you can turn on Shadow DOM and go and inspect all of these child elements. It's really interesting. So we've been using Shadow DOM under our noses for a while. It's just now that we can create our own Shadow DOMs. So how do you create one? We have some JavaScript here. It's really similar to the custom element code that we saw earlier, except that after we create an element, and I'm just creating a generic HTML element, which is what most of the examples show you how to do. But if I needed to add semantics, I might want to extend a different kind of an element, like an HTML button. But after you create this element, there's a method that you can call called created callback, and you can add code to run after the element is created. In this case, we're creating a shadow root with the shadow root. It's this.create shadow root in the function call. And then after that, you can clone content into your shadow DOM and append it to the document. So what this does in effect is it takes your existing node and appends a shadow DOM subtree into it. So kind of the two magic things here to make shadow DOM happen. In the created callback event, or the callback, you can say create shadow root, and then the shadow root, you append content into it. And in this case, I'm also registering a taco surprise element. But I think you could probably append shadow DOM. Yeah, I need to go back and visit this, but in the way that I always did it, I created a custom element. I was curious if you could add shadow DOM to an existing element. I think you probably can. So I have a little demo. Given that we had some difficulties earlier, I'm not sure that how it's going to work with VoiceOver, but let's open it. And a little warning, if you go and look at these slides, and I'm going to post them at the end, this demo has a giant GIF on it, like really, really big. I intended to only look at it on my local machine. But we can go and look at this little shadow DOM widget that I've created. So I'm going to open the developer tools.
Yeah, hold on. Let me. Sorry, did you want me to turn on VoiceOver? Because this is going to have to go through my speakers.
You know, I don't think we need to. We can we are already at 9:40. I think we can probably just look at the dev tools here, and I can explain what we're looking at.
All right, I'm going to take the mouse real quick and turn off my mic, and then I'll be back.
Got it. Okay, so we're looking at this demo, and my idea for shadow DOM element is that what if you had a button that had multiple states, and you just want to be able to drop in a single button, but make it so that the user has to engage it before they can do anything. So maybe it's like a nuclear detonator, and you know those switches, you have to like flip a cover and then you can turn on a button. Well, in this case, I made an explosions warning button that you have to slide to engage. It kind of looks like the unlock screen on an iPhone. So I made a button that you can tab onto. Let's see if I can actually tab onto it. All right, so I'm on this button. I could use the mouse, but I also made it so that you can use the arrows. So if I use the arrow keys and wait, should start moving any day now. I promise I made it work with the keyboard. Oh, there it goes. There it goes. Okay, we're in the next phase. Yes, we really want explosions. Before I show you this giant GIF, I'm going to go zoom in here and look at we made a slider control, and there is actually a shadow DOM here. I think we need to go enable it, which is worth looking at. In Chrome, you can show shadow DOM by going to the settings in the developer tools. Oh, it's already enabled. You know, I'm curious. When you enabled that before, and maybe Alice Boxall can answer this, have they started hiding the shadow trees? Oh, don't have the shadow DOM flag on, so there might be a flag required as well. So what I wanted to show you here is that we have, actually there is a boundary here, but we're just seeing elements. They're just being appended into the page because this is after JavaScript and CSS do their thing, like I was talking about earlier with the browser rendering experience. The screen reader is presented with a single tree. So this is accessible because it has already, like by the time the screen reader gets a hold of it, it's one happy tree. I like to joke about Bob Ross, the artist, and how he would talk about happy little trees. There's one happy tree here because the screen reader is encountering the page after rendering, or as rendered is the term. So here we have multiple buttons, and we're just getting one happy tree, which is awesome. So Yeah, we're really ready now. I'm gonna close this. Close the DevTools. It looks like we're using the polyfill. So we're not seeing the shadow DOM. But the explosions, there's actually a GIF that's supposed to load in the background here. I like showing GIFs. I don't know if you've caught on to that yet, but the idea here was that I created a web component that had multiple parts, and you engage it. The use case would be creating a single tag that the user could have multiple states, but they only have to drop in a single tag. So it's a little contrived as well, but you can hopefully get an idea of why you might create a custom element or create a shadow DOM. And in the case of shadow DOM, it would be to encapsulate the document subtree so that you don't have interference with scripts or styles outside of the shadow DOM boundary. All right, so current support of shadow DOM. Chrome 25, it's been in there for a little while. I think you have to enable a flag or turn it on in the DevTools, but it will actually render the things. Whether or not you can see the shadow DOM boundary in the developer tools, that is why you might need a flag. But enabling shadow DOM in general to actually create the nodes, it has been in Chrome for a little while, according to caniuse.com. So if they're accurate, that's where this is coming from. Firefox is just now turning this on in their nightly. And then Chrome for Android as well is worth noting. So there's lots of places you can go and check on support, and so I link to those in these slides. For Xtag, with their polyfill, they expand support all the way back to Firefox 5 and Chrome 4. As far as I know, you can't add a shadow DOM through their library, but if you might be able to kind of hack it in there when you create a custom element and do kind of a mashup of native JavaScript and Xtag JavaScript. I have a question out to Angelina Fabreau right now asking more about that, so I'm curious to know if people are actually using shadow DOM with Xtag, but I couldn't really find any evidence of that. So with Xtag, when you use their polyfill, you can get support in Internet Explorer back to 9, which is in comparison to Polymer, which is another really awesome polyfill and platform. They are only IE 10 and above. So if you were going to use this and you knew if you were going to create custom elements and you knew that you had to support IE 9, I mean, you could make a case that maybe using one polyfill over another, it's worth looking at your analytics and seeing which browsers you need to support and go and look at what that polyfill, what they can cover for you. A lot of websites have the luxury now of only supporting the latest, but it's not super realistic. I think we're leaving a lot of people out if we don't support some of the older browsers. In the case of IE, that's just always challenging and really costly. So the difference between IE 9 and IE 10 can be quite a bit of development time. So some resources here before we wrap up. I created a little, if you click this short URL, it's http://tiny.cc/a11y-web-components. That's a link to my slides and a resources file with a couple of specs and nice websites I like looking at to learn more about the stuff. And I believe that is it for the end. So if you have any questions, I am all ears, and I hope to learn more. It's always a learning process because, like I said, this stuff changes so fast that it's not exactly solid footing when you're doing research on emerging specs.
Well, thanks very much, Marcy. I don't see any questions that you did not address during the presentation. I guess we'll stick around for just a minute. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to mark them down in the chat box or the Q&A box, and Marcy will be happy to address them.
Yeah, and if you ever have questions, just shout out on Twitter. I love Twitter. It's such a great way to get in touch with browser implementers and spec writers and movers and shakers. So if you ever have questions, or if you saw something that's changing already and you're like, hey, you should check this out, then reach out to me on Twitter. It's @Marcy Sutton. I love it, so I would love to chat with you.
I think Todd had a question about the file size overhead of Polymer.
Oh, good question. I think, yeah, Polymer is 163K minified, 48K gzip, which is pretty big. It is pretty big, yeah, and it's worth taking a look at that in your environment. When you're creating projects like this, the stuff you have to weigh, like not only browser support, but if you had a concern about performance or load time, you should definitely keep an eye on all of these resources that you're pulling in. And if there's one polyfill that does the bare minimum number of things you need and it's not as big and it supports your browser matrix, then those should be decisions that you make when you pull in these libraries. For my research, I actually didn't use Polymer's whole platform. I only used their shim so that I could get support beyond just Chrome latest and Opera. I could go and look at it in Internet Explorer.
Oops, I think we lost Marcy again. Well, as she tries to get back, I just want to thank everybody for attending the presentation. Really appreciate participation and appreciate you giving us this opportunity. This concludes the presentation for accessible components.